Brexit. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. So you heard the Prime Minister ruling out a customs union, which is what you say you want, and saying we will have less access to EU markets in future. You can't be very happy with this speech, can you?
Well, I think it was a very realistic speech. I think it set out the compromises, the hard facts that we've all got to face in the Brexit process. And I think that was a very welcome dose of realism. And that's why I think it has been welcomed by people on all sides of the debate, because we can get away from pretending that things are going to stay the same, that we can have exact same benefits, and be honest with ourselves, with our constituents, about what that means. And look, turn to the amendment. Let's take a step back. The reason that MPs, backbench MPs like me, put down amendments is to get ministers to explain their positions more fully. And that's what we began to see in the Prime Minister's speech on this issue of the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland on Friday. The Prime Minister could not have been more clear this morning, last week, that she does not want to see a hard border between the two, and that's exactly where we are as well. I think there are more discussions to come in Westminster about the two options, as Anushka was just setting out there, that the Prime Minister outlined, and I think we'll have to see what happens when the bill comes back to the House of Commons.
Well, but your amendment wasn't just about Northern Ireland. It said that you wanted the UK to stay in a customs union with the EU, and not just because of the Irish border issue. Now you say that you want to talk to the Prime Minister about this. We'll talk about what? We're either in a customs union or we're not, and her speech made pretty clear she didn't want a customs union.
Well, actually, I can speak for myself, speak for my colleagues, many of whom put their names down. It absolutely was about the Irish border issue, because I think many of us have got to the stage of thinking, how on earth can this be resolved to avoid a hard border without being in a customs union? I think that's very important. It's A. And I think many of us don't care really what it's called. It's a question of what it does. Does it avoid a hard border? Does it avoid small traders having to make declarations each time they cross the border? I was a Treasury Duties Minister. I visited the Irish border, and it is 300 miles of incredibly porous countryside, basically, and people are crossing it every day for work, for trading, and it's not just about the economics, it's about the cultural, the political significance of not reinstating a hard border. So yes, we're going to have further discussion.
Don't seem to think that this is a practical solution. The Irish government, the Irish Foreign Minister, Simon Coveney, was saying this morning he didn't think the EU would accept this. I mean, Theresa May has said all along she doesn't want a hard border. Just saying that doesn't mean it's going to happen, and the EU don't seem satisfied with what she laid out on Friday as a possible solution.
Well, I think there's two important points there. The first is, as I said, I think in a tweet on Friday, the EU cannot now say, and I think Simon Coveney recognised this on Mar this morning, the EU cannot now say that it doesn't know what the UK government wants, and that's a big step forward. Simon Coveney also agreed, as the Prime Minister rightly set out, that yes, this is a problem that has been created by Brexit. It's up to the three parties, the UK government, the EU and the Irish government, to work together to find a solution. I think it's right that talks are going to continue. It may be one of those areas where actually it's best for the Irish government and the UK government to be talking directly, because at the moment what's been remarkable about these negotiations has been how cohesive the 27 have been in negotiating through the Commission, but there may be ways to speed up discussions, particularly on the Irish border issue. But more broadly, what we saw on Friday is the Prime Minister saying there's going to be some difficult things ahead, we've got to get on with it. People aren't going to remember, ultimately, the negotiations. They're going to remember the enduring deal that is struck, that puts people's livelihoods and economic security first. And I think she's right. Look, we're not...
Well, let's talk about that.
Negotiations.
One of the hard facts that she laid out was that we will have less access to EU markets. And that's one of the things that you, as a Remainer, have been worried about. Maybe she's being pragmatic and you welcome that, but is that pragmatism not admitting that we're going to be worse off in future as a result of this?
I think it probably is. And I think actually, again, why the speech was welcome in its tone was because it did set out some of these hard truths. You know, there are people who have said, well, nothing's going to change. It's going to have exactly the same benefits. That's clearly not the case. You know, I'm obviously chair of the Treasury Select Committee. We look a lot at financial services. You know, the financial services industry understand things are going to change, and the Prime Minister was clear, no more passporting, which I think people have reconciled themselves to in the city. The question was, okay, what next? Now she's talking rightly about mutual recognition of regulations. That absolutely is the way to go, and that is achievable. But as I was going to say, this is a start of negotiations. There is a long way to go, but at least we're now on the starting blocks. And let me just say something else. I think you're right to say that many of us have been concerned about the prosperity, the livelihoods of people in our constituencies and of businesses. We welcome this speech, absolutely, but we will continue to watch out for any sort of drifting backwards towards some kind of ideologically driven hard Brexit, because that doesn't benefit anybody. As the Prime Minister said on Friday, reverting to WTO is not a good outcome. It's not something that will benefit people in this country.
The Prime Minister made clear that the UK after Brexit can either choose to stay aligned with the rules and regulations of the EU, or this or future parliaments could choose to diverge. In those circumstances, you're going to be fighting every step of the way to try and stay aligned with the EU, I take it?
Well, no, not necessarily. And I think, again, that was a really welcome statement from the Prime Minister, that actually it's for the sovereign parliament to be making these decisions in future. And this is exactly why we had the debate over the amendment in December, because ultimately it should be sovereign parliament that actually makes these key decisions in the future. So, for example, in terms of divergence of regulation, there may well be good arguments in the future why businesses and industries say, actually, we don't need to be aligned with that particular regulation because there's actually a higher international standard that we can all get around and follow, and that actually will benefit our businesses. But the point is, just at the moment, where Parliament will take decisions about things on the basis of listening to constituents, and that's what MPs will do, that's exactly what will happen in the future, and I think that's welcome. And again, as I say, financial services, that is exactly the message that we are getting back, which is that there are some international standards, which actually is what businesses already comply with, that are higher standards than the EU, and that's what the businesses want to carry on complying with.
OK, Nicky Morgan, thank you very much for talking to us. Well, listening to that is the former Conservative leader, Lord Howard, who campaigned for Britain to leave the EU, and you were nodding away in agreement with Nicky Morgan all the way through that interview. Not something we thought we were going to see happen in this studio. Well, do you agree with her?
I agree with very much of what she said, Sarah, and I'm, of course, delighted to be able to agree with her. Can I just say this about the speech on Friday? I thought it showed the Prime Minister at her best. Calm, patient, disciplined. That's exactly the kind of approach we need in these negotiations. I think Steve Richards was absolutely right when he said she's the only person who can lead the country through these negotiations, and she showed her qualities on Friday, and I think it was an excellent speech. And it is something not only, of course, it's a good thing from my point of view that it seems to have united united the Conservative Party, but much more importantly, I think it's united the country. I think everyone in the country, except perhaps for those few people on either extreme, can rally round
people like
this approach.
John Major and Tony Blair.
Well, I fear that on this issue, John Major and Tony Blair are two of the people who have never been able to reconcile themselves to the results of the referendum. But I think that, you know, a large majority of people in the country, even of those who voted Remain, now say, let's get on with it, let's see what we can get out of these negotiations. And Nicky Morgan was absolutely right when she said, in years to come, people will not be looking back at the negotiations. They'll be looking back on the outcome.
Yes, but the negotiations matter because they determine the outcome. Now, you like the tone of the speech. When you look at the detail of it, though, does it really amount to taking back control when the Prime Minister says the UK will need to make a strong commitment that its regulatory standards will remain as high as the EU, and that in practice that will mean they'll remain substantially similar in the future? That's not what you campaigned for.
Well, in many respects, they will be similar. And as the Prime Minister said this morning on the MAR programme, in many respects, these rules and regulations are not EU regulations, they're international regulations. But the crucial thing is that in future, our sovereign parliament will be able to decide whether we remain in alignment, which in many cases it'll be a sensible thing to do, or whether we diverge, which in many circumstances it will be a sensible thing to do. That's what taking back control means. Yes, our sovereign parliament will decide.
But look at where we do remain in alignment, and the hard fact Theresa May put out there was in order to maintain access, we may have to maintain alignment. The EU is going to change their rules over the next few years. We'll end up having to mirror rules that we had no say in making at all if we want to maintain access. That's not control.
We'll have to decide, but we will be able to decide. Yes, in some cases, it may well be sensible to change our rules to remain in alignment with the European Union's rules. But in other cases, it won't be. And we will be able to decide. That's what taking back control means. That's what we will achieve.
And you're perfectly happy with associated membership of some of the European agencies. You proposed the Medicines Agency, the Chemicals Agency, the Aviation Safety Agency, and with paying a fee to remain an associate member?
Very sensible for the reasons the Prime Minister set out on Friday. These
a year ago, you wouldn't have been telling us you wanted to stay a member of any of these agencies at all.
You never asked me, Sarah. I think you'd have been surprised by the answer. These arrangements are very sensible, practical arrangements from which the European Union benefits and we benefit, and it's therefore sensible that we should be in association with them.
Now, we were promised, of course, famously by David Davis, that we would have the exact same benefits of being in the customs union and the single market after Brexit. The Prime Minister herself said something very similar, and now she's telling us we will have less access. When people were told that we could leave the EU and maintain the exact same benefits, were they being lied to?
Not at all. And I think it's a consequence of what the Prime Minister has said, that in all important respects, we will have the access we need. There may be some areas where that will not be the case, but she dealt with the most important aspects in her speech on Friday, and she showed how in those important areas we will be able to continue to have access. And I think that will be the outcome. It's in the interests of the European Union, as well as ourselves, that that should be so. They want access to our large market. We are one of the 6 biggest economies in the world. They want access to our markets. It will be in both our interests to reach that sort of agreement.
Now, both wings of the Tory party might be happy with this. The speech was received a little less enthusiastically in Brussels, as I'm sure you know. The EU are going to publish their draft guidelines for the how they say a future deal on Tuesday. If they just don't accept the approach that Theresa May's laid out, what should she do next?
Look, let's concentrate on the positives. We're in a negotiation. There will inevitably be posturing by the European Union in the course of these negotiations. That's what negotiations always bring with them. But I think, as I say, it's in their interest, it's in our interest that we should have a good deal. And at the end of the day, Sarah, they want our money.
Yes, but there
and
is
they're not going to get our money unless there's a good deal.
That they're budging. Guy Verhofstadt said that a trade deal can't be achieved by putting a few extra cherries on the Brexit cake. This speech did not persuade him that there's a deal to be done.
He's not in charge of the negotiations.
Well, Michel Barnier didn't seem terribly impressed either. It doesn't look as though they're going to accept the Prime Minister's view that you can negotiate different terms of access for different sectors and that isn't cherry picking.
Let's wait and see. Michel Barnier welcomed the speech. There's a lot of posturing. At the end of the day, it's in their interests and ours to arrive at a deal which is very similar to that which the Prime Minister set out on Friday.
You're being very positive about what the EU's likely to do. They may well not do that. Is there a point at which the Prime Minister may be forced to just walk away from this because they will not meet her halfway, which is what she was asking for on Friday?
I hope not. But if you go into any negotiation saying, I want a deal at any price, you'll be taken to the cleaners. That's true of absolutely every negotiation. So I entirely agree with the Prime Minister when she says that in the ultimate circumstance, no deal is better than a bad deal. But I don't think we're going to have a bad deal. I think we're going to have a deal along the lines the Prime Minister set out on Friday.
Well, what she set out was we're all going to have to compromise. We're not all going to get what we want. We're going to have to meet somewhere in the middle of this. And the response from the EU has not been to say, yes, we agree. Let's start talking about compromises. It's been to maintain a lot of their hard red lines about cherry picking.
Yeah, but that will change. Their approach to the negotiations on the first stage changed. All sorts of figures were bandied about the money we'd have to pay. They bore no reality to the ultimate outcome. So, you have to take these initial negotiating positions with a pinch of salt.
Yeah, but if you look at what happened when the EU was negotiating with Greece during its financial crisis, they didn't soften their lines at all. They were absolutely insistent on that. There are occasions on which they simply do not budge.
No disrespect to Greece, but we are not Greece. The European Union needs access to our markets. The European Union needs our money. The situation is very, very different from that which obtained between the European Union and Greece.
All right, Lord Howard, thank you for talking to us this morning.
Thank you.
Now, as we've heard, Jeremy